As of the date of this recording, many see the current conflict in Ukraine as an extension of the 2014 crisis. However, many may not fully understand what the causes of that crisis were. This video is not meant to be considered comprehensive or definitive, but merely serve to add context to the factors contributing to 2014. The points could be summarized as the Western views on foreign policy, the US and Russia going into the 2000s, the 2008 Bucharest NATO summit and Georgia, the final decade of Ukraine's leadership, and the final deals that triggered the crisis, as well as 5 of Russia's motivations. Introspection on Ukraine is not possible without examining Russia and the West's interests. Unfortunately, Ukraine does not exist within a vacuum. After the Cold War, the idea of Western hegemony would reign supreme, unchallenged. However, early in the new millennium, a new threat would change global foreign policy, and it would have far-reaching consequences, most directly in the Middle East, but with many indirect ones, such as in Eastern Europe. Under the Bush presidency, the USA became more conscious of security threats from abroad, both state-based and stateless. One of these potential threats was a rising China. However, there was already a counter to this threat in existence: Russia. Despite how things may look today, initially the idea of multipolarism was made to counter the idea of new bipolarism between the US and China. The potential of China's rise was notable as far back as the 70s, however this priority was low as China itself was viewed as a counter to the more powerful Soviet Union. This counterbalance strategy of using strong regional powers is as old as politics itself. Some notable examples include 18th and 19th century Britain, who used France as its proxy on mainland Europe. Today, modern France and Germany share this relationship within the EU, and the US uses the UK as a gateway partner into Europe. There are also failures in applying this strategy, such as when Imperial Japan tried to create a partner in Manchukuo, or the West's most notorious example being the dual-pillar strategy of the Middle East. Backed by the US, Saudi Arabia and Iran were meant to balance each other as well as the Middle East as a whole. Iran's breakaway from the West resulted in Israel replacing it, a nation that often acts in offense for self-defense, while Saudi Arabia sponsors various levels of involvement with its neighbors, particularly in Yemen's current civil war. In the early 2000s, the US sought to implement a similar two-pillar strategy in Eurasia. The dominance of the West in the 90s and the early 2000s allowed the implementation of America's doctrine of world peace through Western hegemony. A core belief in the West's victory in the Cold War was that liberal democracies had inherent prosperity granted to them by following the rules set by Western political and economic systems. Eventually, the more a nation adhered and integrated into these systems, the more those nations would transform into liberal democracies, and in Western thinking, democracies don't declare war on each other, leading to world peace. These systems were considered too great and valuable to ignore or break away from. Thus, the US thought it was only a matter of time before incorporating all the world into liberal democracies, using itself as a model of such a nation if necessary. This idea seemed validated when the West intervened in the Yugoslav conflicts to prevent genocide, even receiving Russian cooperation on the matter, leading to further confidence in this new world order of Western hegemony. After the rise of terrorism replaced communism as its main threat, the now ultra-security conscious West sought to consolidate its new world view with its inbuilt security measures and even expand them. NATO barely expanded after the Cold War. Many nations involved had cut their military spending, and only 3 other nations had joined. However, by the end of the Bush presidency, additions to NATO included the Baltic nations, the East Balkan nations, and further talks to include territory of the former Yugoslavia were ongoing. Russia, in the meantime, had greater hurdles to overcome, not just economically, but even staying as one nation. It was forced to fight off armed secessionism, particularly in the North Caucasus, and terrorism on a level so extreme that it even suffered an Islamic State-style invasion of its own territory. Head of the FSB at the time, Vladimir Putin saw a military modernization campaign that fought back against this anti-Russian aggression. A symbol of this came in the Caucasus battles, when a then new T-90 tank took fire from 7 RPGs and continued to fight back. And after he ascended to the presidency, terrorist attacks in Russia went from over 200 a year to less than 50. The Bush administration even complimented Putin as an ally against terrorism, with even more security-oriented staff complimenting his security over rights approach to dealing with terrorists. It should be noted that Putin has an unusual relationship in contrasting with US presidents, as Russia is seen as a constructive force on the world when the US is seen as a destructive one. It is something that strangely compounds and intensifies with each successive president. Given the worldview of the US and its assurances that the Russians were allies in the fight against terror, the push to secure Eastern Europe as part of the West, or at least a benign partner, only seemed to increase in the minds of US foreign policymakers. However, Russia was not so optimistic. An old joke in Russia goes, "Everything the communists said about themselves was a lie. Everything they said about capitalism was true." This and the subsequent crisis after crisis of simply keeping the nation together made the Russian state insular in its thinking. Coupled by the fact that many in government had come from the KGB, an organization of politics first and intelligence second, leads to much of its leadership being taught to think of power plays in geopolitics as their second nature. Around the same time, Belarus and its leader Lukashenko almost took power from Moscow to make Minsk the new joint capital of Belarus and Russia. Putin's rise forwarded this. All this meant was having to rebuild a fractured state to defend from enemies within and without was ingrained in the Putin regime before it took power. The Russian state was not in any mood to see its enemies encroach on its former sphere of influence. However, due to its problems at the time, it was virtually powerless to stop it. It was only after the 2008 NATO Bucharest summit, in which Putin was invited as an honored guest, were these intentions clarified to the West. The subject of the meeting were standard security concerns of the time, cooperating on fighting terrorism, Macedonia's membership, Kosovo, Iraq, and the freedom of military movement. For the most part, it seemed to go smoothly. However, there was an action of great consequence. Though waved off at the time, it would only snowball in importance from here. Although it was officially rejected, NATO still announced the intent to extend membership to Georgia and Ukraine. Russia publicly disapproved of this. This announcement would only compound with other concurrent issues. By 2008, worsening relations between Georgia and Russia had grown volatile, and pro-West Georgia hoped to address many of them at the summit. The results, or lack thereof, only inflamed matters further, leading to a 12-day war where, starting August 1st, Russia backed the secessionist regions of Georgia and subsequently annexed them from their southern neighbor. In 2008, Russia firmly marked its territory and drew lines at the border regions. While there was outcry and denouncement, most action aside was minimal. Despite Georgia's pro-Western shift and willingness to join both NATO and the EU, it subsequently received no Western backing and has since stopped serious pursuit of the idea. Despite cutting ties in 2008, in 2010 to 2012, relations between Georgia and Russia were normalized. Georgia proceeds to remain amicable with Russia as the regional power. This was reinforced in 2020 during the brief war with their mutual neighbors Armenia and Azerbaijan, in which Russia arbitrated the ceasefire. It should be noted that NATO invitations were not universally approved. Russia under Putin had risen in prominence enough to make his intentions of the surrounding territory clear by this point. France and Germany also strongly objected to the idea at the summit. Poland largely stated by diplomatic means before and since that Ukraine's integration into NATO was not a good idea. Reasons for such disapproval at the time came from many practical standpoints. Aside from the general mutual antagonism, Russia and Ukraine were largely thought of as a package deal. Offering one naturally includes the other. Many thought of the idea of Russia and NATO cooperation was good, but integration was not. This was because it was either too expensive for either side to be feasible, or it would reach the point where NATO would eventually collapse and even be rendered virtually irrelevant. After the 2008 Georgian conflict, the West would start taking a different approach to Putin's Russia. The idea of integrating Russia as part of the Western sphere faded into thoughts of a multipolar world. However, the idea of Ukrainian integration did not. Crucially, Ukraine's Westernization was not dissuaded or discouraged, both internally and externally. Now we reach Ukraine itself. The first real contact Ukraine had with Westernization ironically came with a scandal, in which weapons were sold from Ukraine to Iraq, amongst other perceived enemies of the USA. The Bush administration came down on Ukraine for this, but surprisingly Ukraine cooperated and stopped the sales, and even offered freedom of military movement in the fight against terror. It was here Ukraine started the public shift towards the West, with then President Yushchenko even announcing Ukraine's intention to join the EU and NATO. The war on terror's contact with Ukraine furthered Westernization to the point where anti-corruption movements emerged as a political force within Ukraine itself. Partially inspired by Georgia's 2003 Rose Revolution, protests in 2004, the Orange Revolution, was a peaceful demonstration focused on anti-corruption and change in government. Coupled with Yushchenko's mysterious poisoning at the time, he was soon ousted and two new leaders of Ukraine stepped up to head the nation, Yulia Tymoshenko and Viktor Yanukovych. This looked like a hopeful foundation for Ukraine. Both leaders had pro-EU Western leanings. Both had participated in the Orange Revolution. Both were the two most popularly elected officials in the country. Yanukovych became the president in charge of the nation. Timoshenko became prime minister, domestic leader of the nation. However, there was a critical flaw. They hated each other. Throughout their careers in office, both accused each other of corruption. They did not hold back their enmity towards one another, and even attacked personal qualities. Nothing was off grounds. It even got to the point where they exchanged death threats. None of what I mentioned was done privately. If there were a greater antagonist of the two, it would be Yanukovych. His career in action and quality would make Donald Trump seem tame. He was particularly known to be a bully of anyone who disagreed with him, political or public, and has a legacy of splitting his party with his decisions, often backflipping on his own rhetoric and exacerbating division with his people and nation between pro-Europe and pro-Russian factions. The Orange Revolution had not only changed government, but also triggered a cultural crisis in Ukraine as to where it looks politically, Russia or Europe, a crisis that would only grow under such dysfunctional leadership. It should be noted Yanukovych's government was pro-EU. They would often find it easier to approach and deal with the Western governments. Russia would counter by making more deals that were easier to accept, and outbidding or pressuring him. This plus his predecessor's poisoning in the back of his mind, Yanukovych performed many public backflips. This framed pro-Russian politics as the source of corruption in Ukrainian politics. Though this ignores the more integrated post-Soviet EU states' battles with their own corruption, it became the reality for Ukrainians in their public's consciousness. All this and other actions besides have him remembered as a pro-Russian puppet. The situation would only worsen after the 2008 global financial crisis, in which Timoshenko would successfully apply for a 13.5 billion euro loan from the International Monetary Fund to save Ukraine's finances. This loan would become a debt that would change the nation. After the 2010 election, the results would keep the status quo. By this point, Yanukovych was utterly sick of his rival and had her jailed for 7 years. Timoshenko would not take this lying down and countersued him and his government. Yanukovych would continue his strategy of upsetting everyone with such moves to the point where everyone had sanctioned Ukraine at least once for his actions at some point. And deals made to pay off these debts would be a major factor in the 2014 crisis. Facing bankruptcy and needing money any way he could get it, Yanukovych would chant his pro-Europe stances while begging them for loans. The EU offered deals of up to 600 million euro, but by this point 19 billion euro would be needed to cover the IMF debt. Such offers and deals from Ukraine's point of view were often described by several members of its government as poor. Ukraine's NATO representative even commented that Europe spat on us. A view that seemed to validate itself the longer the situation dragged on, with more begging for loans and deals and less willing partners to pick from. The biggest problems with the EU and IMF deals and re-deals were the conditions applied to gain more money and cancel more debt. Yanukovych's corruption was so ingrained during his reign that implementing changes desired to fulfill the criteria of any deals was virtually impossible, meaning that qualifying for any further loans paid out less and less over time, and even hurt Ukraine's economy trying to meet them. Yanukovych's government described the conditions as extremely harsh, and taking action to meet said conditions only facilitated a rise in domestic gas prices, and from there forced a cut in pensions, among other things. Russia, in the meantime, had formed the Ukraine Action Plan. It was willing to lift the sanctions on Ukraine's meat and buy off the IMF debt for 15 billion euro, all the while cheapening Ukraine's gas prices. It all seemed too good to be true, and whilst Yanukovych accepted, his parliament said it was, and blocked its passing. It was criticized for effectively surrendering almost all of Ukraine's oil infrastructure controls to Russia. This deal and actions around it would only further divide Yanukovych's party and the nation. With EU deals paying less and less and trying to change Ukraine's economy from within, and Russia tempting Ukraine out of debt for oil, bankruptcy looming over Yanukovych, he searched again for another partner to alleviate the IMF debt. More of his government officials only returned with the same sentiments. Brussels was unwilling to support Ukraine. Yanukovych, however, caught a break in the form of Vice President Biden. After some correspondence, it concluded with Biden's words, "He sorted that thing with the IMF." This new deal had severely cut down the IMF debt, but by this point the conditions to improve Ukraine's economy were too steep, and the accounts were nearly dry. Russia had not given up on supporting Ukraine. It amended its action plan and even included cooperation with the IMF and EU as part of this deal. Unfortunately, while this deal was extremely promising, the EU pulled out. Distrusting Russia, it criticized the deal for containing coercive elements. The deal was dead, but Yanukovych tried again to re-sign the action plan anyway, despite opposition from everywhere. Nearing the end of 2013, as the nation grew poor, Yanukovych desperately tried to pass through the Ukraine Action Plan, but was denied by his parliament and ruled as unconstitutional. This deal was the last straw, and triggered the Euromaidan protest, much like the Orange Revolution but more pro-European than before. By 2014, Maidan protesters were met with anti-Maidan pro-Russian counter-protesters in the southeast of Ukraine. While anti-Maidan was outnumbered, the two groups inspired a reaction of counter-protests, which further inspired larger counter-protests. The cultural crisis in Ukraine was proceeding to boil. After violent suppression measures, Yanukovych was ousted and Tymoshenko was released. Various deals with Russia were cancelled or up for cancellation, and not just economic ones. The Kharkiv Accords leased the Sevastopol, Crimea naval base to the Black Sea Fleet was cancelled and not to be renewed. This meant that rather than a 30-year extension, the Russian Navy would have to leave in 3 years. The movement also resulted in a purge targeting corrupt officials, which would only intensify as time went on. The anti-corruption movement went after pro-Russian officials anywhere. Yanukovych's entire party, all former communists, even outspoken anti-Yanukovych officials were all scrutinized. After the crisis, they would all be officially purged from government. The pro-EU movement renewed, a new deal was made to solve the economy. The EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. This deal was soon signed alongside the purges, and without any consultation or cooperation with Russia. It was also heralded as the first step of EU-Ukraine integration. With Russia's mindset, it all seemed an anti-Russian coup was taking place right at their border. With time ticking and panic rising, Russia weighed the risk. The stage was set. Into Russia's motivations. Several have already been mentioned, but now we analyze from Russia's point of view. The chaos and destabilization in Ukraine and anti-Russian purging was reminiscent of the Georgian situation. Unlike Georgia, however, the police were not encountering armed resistance in autonomous areas. So far, with protests and counter-protests. And while police were dispatched, it still wasn't to the level where they were encountering armed resistance, such as they were in Georgia. Georgia's autonomous regions were already resisting before the Russians arrived. There was significant pro-Russian sentiment. It still wasn't at the level of a civil war. Quick reminder, Georgia had normalized relations with Russia after only 2 to 4 years. And while not a direct comparison, there was enough overlap to liken similar strategies to used in Ukraine. The economic deal to Russia was a way of buying time to neutralize Ukraine into a buffer state. Although it heavily favored Russia, they were the ones paying for most of the bill. Why else would anyone make a deal for such a large amount of money, the Russians thought? And such deals were hardly rare in politics. The deal allowed for Ukraine to swing towards the West economically whilst being energy dependent on Russia. The EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, in contrast, feels like a direct counter, and even a stab in the back. It excluded Russia completely, and coupled with the announcement of EU integration, the Russians could only take it as the West announcing that Russia had no future with Ukraine. Denying them cooperation and, having countered their deal, this aggressive Western action alongside the purges triggered Russia into counteraction. As for military motivations, the vulnerability of Russia's border with Ukraine is not only untenably large, but grants access to Russia's key population and administrative centers, as well as resources to the Caucasus regions, which have been targeted before. Considering how much energy Russia expended to retain control of the region, they are not willing to let it destabilize again. Another military interest is the Black Sea Fleet, its location making it highly significant in many areas. Sevastopol's location is no coincidence. Even since ancient times, naval powers have been projecting from here, due to its near-central location to the Black Sea. Moving the base to anywhere else would be extremely costly, not only in effectiveness but in support. Complying with Ukraine would have turned Crimea into a potential barrier and leverage against Russia. The Caucasus is too mountainous to resupply effectively from, meaning that there would be a need for a support chain of supply bases to be built. This would only balloon the cost of maintenance, and the result would be severe redundancy. On top of reducing costs, it also acts as a direct counter to the NATO air base in Turkey, which is also used for similar power projection in the Black Sea. A neighbor in chaos. A hostile coup. Border and naval vulnerabilities are all reasons that pushed Russia into action. However, what is yet to be considered might be the biggest motivator for 2014's crisis. What you're seeing is a rough layout of probably the biggest motivation towards any action in Ukraine. You see, Ukraine is a key pathway for one of the world's largest and most complex pipeline networks in the world. When you remember that Russia is essentially a petrostate with its energy supply being a key strategic asset in its economics and geopolitics, this map becomes extremely important. If it isn't already obvious, a recoloring should make it clear. Red are the pipes directly in Ukraine, green are those directly affected by Ukraine, and purple are the reactions to Ukraine. As Ukraine drifted away from Russia, it responded by building more pipelines to reduce Ukraine's potential influence on Russia. In the south, we have the purple Turk Stream pipeline, which delivers to a key customer, Turkey, fuels from the Caucasus regions. There are even plans to create a branch from this into Bulgaria, and from there it'll extend into Central Europe and Italy. In the north, a second line was made to pump through to Belarus, which in turn goes through Poland. Germany, another key customer of Russia, receives it from Poland and Nord Stream 1. It then resells this down the line to the Low Countries and through to the UK. The Nord Stream pipelines are a way for Russia to connect to one of its best customers and negotiate prices directly, as opposed to going through Poland and Belarus. Nord Stream 2 was meant to be an extension of this, although Poland does get another consolation prize, with another bypass created to feed directly into Central Europe. Just seeing the effort in bypassing Ukraine demonstrates how important and how deep the risk this network presents to Russia. But to make it even clearer, here are the pro-Russian regions overlaid with the network. Combine this map with everything discussed before it, and the Russian motivation becomes extremely clear. Although 2014 is now largely seen as a foreign policy failure, and even achieved the opposite of its objectives, after seeing it in context, it's difficult not to see the same kind of irony in the lead-up to it, as well as seeing the lack of lessons learned by all parties into 2022's crisis. If there is a takeaway, it might be that diplomacy is not a one-way street. One must be an example before demanding it, and accompanied by a prerequisite of understanding. Let us hope that such a thing is not too much to ask for the future. Let me take this moment to apologize to you for the ropey animations and audio. My audio and video capture all failed and took all my work with it, so I had to redo it all over again from scratch. Well, not completely from scratch, but I did have to redub everything at least 3 times, which is why the audio sounds so inconsistent. My apologies again. I'm sure you've also noticed that the images aren't actually animations, they're slides. I just used OBS screen capture on my Photoshop for that part. And sorry for the lack of quality. If you made it this far into the video, thank you, and if you didn't, I don't blame you.